No big celebration, no horns, no royal parade through the fancy halls, just silence. That was the first sign something was not right inside Buckingham Palace on the evening of October 7th, 2025. At exactly 7 p.m., the palace gates were closed, the flag lowered halfway, and the world's oldest royal family seemed to hold its breath. News reporters waiting outside whispered that the king hadn't been seen since morning. Palace workers avoided looking at people. Even the guards, who normally stand still in red and gold, looked worried. Somewhere deep inside the palace, lights turned on in the blue drawing room. A room used only for really important moments, funerals, deaths, and royal confessions. Inside, King Charles III stood alone. No crown, no fancy clothes, only a plain black suit and a single letter held in his hand. His reflection shimmered faintly against the glass doors behind him. Workers waited just outside the room, not sure if they were about to see a royal speech or a royal ending. When he finally spoke, his voice shook, and for the first time in living memory, a king of Britain wiped tears from his eyes before the cameras. No one knew what had hurt him, but everyone watching could feel one thing. This was not politics. This was confession. Hours before the king's tearful announcement, Buckingham Palace had already begun to fall apart from within. It started quietly, as these things always do, not with scandal or yelling, but with a single envelope. A thick cream-colored folder sealed with the symbol of the royal files arrived at the palace at 2:47 p.m., marked for His Majesty's eyes only. When Charles opened it, he found a series of notes talking about a check of royal belongings. But the final page had a signature he hadn't seen in years. Elizabeth R. It wasn't a fake. It was his mother's handwriting. Attached was a handwritten note dated 2019 addressed to him directly. It talked about a backup collection, a group of historical items, letters, and family treasures stored beyond the reach of the government. Among them were mentions of personal letters between Elizabeth and foreign leaders, a few family items never written down, and something else, something crossed out under a black strip of ink labeled Crown Matter Confidential. That crossed out part was what started it all. Charles had lived his entire life under his mother's shadow, taking over both her kingdom and her carefulness. Yet, this file suggested she had kept secrets from even him. For 2 hours, Charles sat in silence in his private study, the file open before him. He reread his mother's note again and again, trying to figure out its meaning. The sentence that bothered him most was simple but terrible. The truth, when buried too long, becomes inheritance. At 5:20 p.m., he asked for a full meeting from the head of royal security. Within the hour, reports from the investigation arrived. Secret documents explaining that certain valuable family treasures and letters had actually been taken from the royal collection decades earlier, quietly moved to private properties for safekeeping. The files proved what tabloids had whispered for years. There were still items missing from the Queen's personal list, including some rumored to have been last seen at Camilla's private home. The discovery hit him like a punch. For months, Charles had fought to bring together a divided family and a tired public. Now, the ghosts of old secrets had returned to destroy his reign. Every feeling told him to keep it buried, to follow the old royal rule. Never complain, never explain. But another voice inside, the one that still remembered his mother's disappointment during his youth, told him this was exactly what had poisoned the royal family for generations. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and looked toward the huge portrait of Elizabeth above his desk. Her painted eyes seemed to ask a single question. Would he be the one to finally tell the truth? At 6:05 p.m., Charles called an emergency meeting of his close group. 5 helpers, 1 priest and princess, and no cameras, no Camilla, no William. The room was dark, the curtains closed. This cannot stay hidden, he said flatly, placing the file on the table. We must tell everything that was kept from the crown. Anne's reaction was immediate. You'll destroy the institution, she said. Charles's voice was calm, but final. Then it deserves to be destroyed. That was when he made his decision. Not quitting, not giving up the throne, something deeper. A public confession live from Buckingham Palace. He would confess not his sins, but the sins of secrets that had haunted them all. By 6:47 p.m., the TV room was being prepared. The staff didn't know what kind of statement they were about to record. But as the king straightened his tie before the mirror, one thought pulsed in his mind, constant and clear. The crown was never meant to hide the truth. The sun had already disappeared behind the palace walls by the time the cameras were set up inside the blue drawing room. The fancy lights glowed faintly against the fading light, casting long shadows across the gold trim and faded portraits. This was the room where kings were meant to look immortal, timeless, untouchable. But that evening, the room felt smaller, and the man standing at its center looked all too human. King Charles appeared without his crown, without his robes, only a simple black suit and a white pocket square. To those watching live, it seemed he had taken off not only the symbols of power, but perhaps the will to carry them. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the cameras began rolling. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was low, almost weak. For many years, I have carried this job with devotion and humility. But tonight, I must speak not as your king, but as a man who has reached the limits of what duty can demand. The words were simple, but their weight fell like stones. It continued, the crown, as you know it, has been built upon hundreds of years of silence. It has survived wars, loss, and betrayal by pretending pain does not exist, but pain does exist, and so does truth. There was a pause long enough for the audience to lean closer to their screens. Then Charles took a deep breath. I have learned that some truths buried for too long do not die quietly. They find ways to rise through us, through history, through the very walls of this palace tonight. I cannot continue to serve while that silence remains unbroken. The words cannot continue struck like a crack of thunder. In the press room, reporters gasped. Outside, the crowd whispered in disbelief. Across the country, living rooms fell into silence as the BBC banner read, "Breaking. King Charles speaks to nation." Charles looked down briefly, then looked directly into the camera, his eyes wet but steady. This is not a moment of shame, but of reckoning. The royal family must no longer be a shield for secrets. And if stepping aside is what it takes to bring back trust, then I do so willingly with love, not anger.